Welcome to Sticking Point, a mini-series from Radio Speicher, where we listen to the voices of the German climate movement to understand its history and its current state. In this episode, we explore the question of just how radical the movement has become.
We talk about what happened in the climate movement after Fridays for Future and XR stopped attracting the numbers onto the streets that they had in 2018 and 2019. We also share a bit more of our own opinions on the public perception of the Letzte Generation and might get into the weeds a bit, so strap in.
This is episode 3 of a 4-part series. We recommend, if you haven't already, go back and start at episode 1 before delving into this one. All right, let's get started. Just as a little recap, last episode we left off at the point where Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion were having a really big impact on the political classes, and we're starting to see these decisions being made in favour of the climate going further than anything that has come before. And then came the pandemic. Paul Hockenos picks up the story here.
It wasn't possible for the Merkel government to ignore hundreds of thousands of kids who were on the street, striking, children striking from school by not going to school.
This is Paul Hockenos, journalist and political commentator working on climate issues.
And so it resulted in a number of improvements in German climate legislation, but still not nearly enough. All climate scientists and the climate movement would agree to reach climate neutrality by 2050. So there were improvements, but they weren't nearly great enough. I think that the Fridays for Futures movement has a lot to be proud of, and I think that they are responsible for a quantum leap in European or maybe even global climate legislation and climate protection. But basically, with the pandemic, the movement's numbers started to fall. There were ever fewer young people on the street. There were ever fewer young people who were willing to strike by not going to school. And I think there were ever fewer parents who were allowed their children to not go to school. So what we have right now is a different situation. The Fridays for Future movement has been losing momentum. Fewer people are on the streets. It's had less of an impact. And what we have are other different organizations like Letzte Generation, Last Generation, and Extinction Rebellion, and many other smaller groups who are taking different forms or using different forms of civil disobedience. And you could really say that these forms are a step further. They're a radicalization of the movement.
Hold up. I think it might be helpful here for us to talk about that term.
Radicalization?
Yeah, exactly. So you and I really grappled with how to bring our own internal debate about that word and how it relates to climate activism into this series. There's a lot to consider. If you follow the German media outlets, you might be seeing the modern German climate movement described as radical. And what are they doing right now that is really radical? Are they making radical demands, for instance? Are they protesting in a way that we would consider to be radical tactics? I think for me, these questions are really interesting when we consider that none of the contemporary factions of the climate movement have really embraced radicalism, and they say that they don't intend to. I mean, the climate crisis is existential. It's about the survival of humans, and in the last few years, I've often wondered, where are the truly radical activists? Why aren't people blowing up pipelines or targeting fossil fuel infrastructure? In the 1970s, there were groups that turned to violence and campaigns of mass intimidation in the hope that they would achieve the visions of what they saw as a utopic society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where my worries about comparisons being made to the Red Army faction, or RAF, that I mentioned at the top of episode 1 come in.
Yeah, I mean, like when we're talking about Germany and we're talking about the 1970s, the Red Army faction would definitely be the main comparison. But could you just give our listeners a quick recap for context on who the Red Army faction were?
Absolutely. So just for background, I researched this group extensively while doing my history master's here in Berlin. And they were the far-left Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group founded in West Germany in 1970. They used bombing campaigns to intimidate the political classes towards change, but they also murdered prominent politicians and business leaders. So the RAF, the Red Army faction, were motivated by the same sort of leftist ideology that you saw as part of this late 1960s historical moment that truly moved around the globe. From the anti-Vietnam War and Black Power movements in the US, communist uprisings in Eastern Europe, and anti-colonial wars being fought in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many of these movements were connected by the ideology that overall society was not as it should be.
The climate crisis is far more terrifying, though, maybe even more pressing in certain ways. And if you're really dedicated to that cause, it just surprises me that there hasn't been more radical wings that have already come out of this movement.
That's maybe debatable, especially if you talk to Black teens in Oakland in 1972, but I get what you mean, Izzy. It's existential, like you said. And still, tactics being used today are vastly different than what radical groups throughout the Cold War were using. Still, I think German media has largely made up its mind, to be honest. I mean, even if not everyone is taking this RAF Red Army faction comparison seriously, the use of the word radical is important. Words matter. I mean, public opinion of these young people who are gluing themselves to streets matters, especially when they get into courtrooms and are sentenced by judges who are also a product of this very political discourse. I'm sure much smarter people than myself can poke holes in this, but I personally just get worried because ultimately the media and politicians wield so much power when they regurgitate these terms like radical. This is how governments and democratic societies can shut down civil disobedience. They inspire fear and can then mobilize the state apparatus against what is seen as a common threat.
When political and media commentators talk about something being radical, it trickles down into the general populace with a different understanding, as being violent, as being extremist, as being scary.
Right, and radical isn't properly defined and explained by the media every time they use it. So people read it and repeat it, they add their own interpretation, and I think this often includes this added layer of violence. I'm absolutely not saying that the average German is a hapless victim of media language and unable to discern what's going on for themselves, but I think it's important to be critical and discerning of the terms that the media uses. Obviously, they want clicks, they want to sell papers, and scare sells.
So I think the reasons why the media use the term radical in the way that they use the term radical and the way that they write about these protest movements, that is essentially a podcast in of itself. It's a piece of subject matter that we don't really have time to go into, but we definitely acknowledge that that is a conversation that is out there and needs to also be had. But in this episode, really what we're trying to do is discern what radical means for these protesters, asking the question of, are they really radical in their demands and are they radical in their tactics? So, let's get back to the foundation of Letzte Generation. So at the start of 2022, videos started appearing of young people gluing their hands to roads. Using glue meant that emergency services would take longer to unstick the protesters' hands, and therefore cause more disruption for a longer amount of time. The tactics had been largely inspired by the British protest group called Insulate Britain. By February 2022, 400 actions had already been documented by police in Germany. And by today, this is more like in the thousands. Clashes between angry motorists and protesters, blocking them from getting to their destinations, have now become a mainstay of newsreels all across Germany.
By now, there are countless videos of protesters getting assaulted with yogurt, put in stress positions by police, being dragged off the road by angry motorists, kicked, curb stomped, verbally abused, and worse. A lot of these visible acts of violence against Letzte Generation protesters were popping up on the news right at the same time that Chancellor Olaf Scholz himself called the group völlig bekloppt, or completely crazy, in late May, which was a prime example of how words have very real implications, since only a couple days later, the German state raided Letzte Generation apartments and headquarters all over the country, with this justification that they were investigating the group as a, quote, criminal organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to get to that last part a little bit later, but at their inception, Letzte Generation infamously threw mashed potatoes at important pieces of art in museums and glued themselves to the frames of paintings. And we should note that no art was actually damaged in the process, but these tactics were meant to catch headlines to shift the focus onto the climate crisis.
Letzte Generation explicitly states on their website that if they are attacked, they will not fight back. That's why you see a lot of these videos where they're sitting there in passive resistance mode as angry motorists grab them by their hair, their limbs, their clothes, and try to drag them away. According to them, Letzte Generation has been pushed to use these tactics because the German government has refused to act against climate change.
We interviewed Tim Wechselmann-Cassim, who talked to us about his experience and the group's demands.
We would like for our government and the governments around the world, society at large, to wake up, in a sense, to take the crisis seriously, to stop bullshitting us and everybody else on the planet, and to actually at least try and attempt to solve the issue. We're not saying, fix it or we're going to rebel. We're saying, at least try, at least give us a chance at a livable future. Is it too much to ask? And that's what we're seeing, that's not happening. It's so obvious if you actually look into the issue and if you look into these studies and the IPCC reports and into the we've got specific demands, but in the end, I always tell people it's not so much about the specific demands. It's more about, getting people to understand, giving society a chance to actually deal with the crisis. We've demanded kind of an Essen retten, Leben retten Gesetz in the beginning of last year to save food from being thrown away. Not because we thought that we're going to solve the issue, but just to get the government to take a first step, showing us that they're taking the crisis seriously. In the summer, we demanded a stop to licensing of new fossil fuel infrastructure. Again, nothing that in and of itself would solve the crisis, but something which we have to do inevitably if we're going to take the crisis seriously. And I think in October, we switched our demands again, demanding a speed limit, a general speed limit, and a cheap ticket for public transport, €9 ticket. Again, not because we think that this will solve the issue, but just as a very easy means of the government of showing us that they actually understood that the issue is seriously and that they're willing to actually do something about it. And what we've shown over the last year, more than anything else, is the unwillingness of our society, of our politicians, of our media people to actually do something about the crisis, right? If anything, that's what has come out of the year, because we've had politicians across the board telling us, all right, guys, we understand it's climate change, it's something we should do something about it, but the speed limit, that's really too much to ask. It's too big of an infringement on their freedoms, freedom of my parents or whatever, the generation of my parents, to ask them to limit their speeding on the Autobahn in order to give us a chance at a livable future. And now we're demanding the implementation of a Gesellschaftsrat.
He's talking about civil assemblies here, a randomly selected group of people who would deliberate on important public questions, which is also a demand of Extinction Rebellion.
Which, in a sense, is a form of democratizing our democracy. It's a form of making sure that the people in our society actually are informed about the seriousness of the crisis, that they get a chance of hearing expert knowledge on the issue in controlled situations without all the bullshit input of Springerpresse. And we believe that if we manage to pressure the government enough to at least try to go forward with such a Gesellschaftsrat, people would understand how serious the issue is, and we could actually get the necessary majorities when the political will for political change.
Okay, these actually sound like really reasonable demands though. So how is this group getting so controversial, even hated?
I've been hearing a lot of criticism, specifically about the emergency vehicles who are getting stopped as a result of these blockades. Letzte Generation maintained that they always let emergency vehicles through, but in the actions on the 24th of April this year, 15 ambulances claimed to have been hindered by protests, leading to long waits for patients. And there was also a notorious case back in November 2022 where a cyclist who had been run over by a cement truck in Berlin died in the hospital, and it was claimed that she died because emergency vehicles couldn't get to her in time. Ultimately, a subsequent investigation found that no different outcome would have resulted if the protesters had not been blocking the road. I also have a really hard time with this point, to be honest, because I'm hearing from young, educated, super lefty friends that this is exactly what's keeping them from supporting Letzte Generation. Ultimately, they do agree with the protesters. They do want structural change for the climate. But I worry that Letzte Generation is losing a base of support that they had been able to count on until now because of this, whether emergency services are really being stopped by their actions or not. Jérémie Gagné has some thoughts on what he calls a cooperation dilemma.
People have very difficult feelings when they approach the issue. And the main problem with the debate is not denial. The main problem is helplessness. We asked people what are the main feelings toward climate change, and a relative majority said my main feeling is helplessness. This feeling of, actually, this is an important issue, and I would like to do something about it, but I'm not confident that the rest of society will act as well. I'm not confident that economic actors will act as well. I'm not confident that politics will act as well, and that has a paralyzing effect. So it's really an issue that many people look at with anxiety or a feeling of paralysis. And also, there's always a danger of just withdrawing into yourself and saying, I can change this. And well, if I can change it, I cannot cope with this all day. And I have to forget it at some point. So we do not have a primary denial crisis when it comes to climate protection. We have a primary confidence crisis that people do not believe in a solution. People in this context where they want more collective action, they are very afraid of individualizing blame games. It's, to put it in simpler terms, this is a metaphor I often use. We should think of climate protection as cleaning up a shared kitchen. If you have 10 people sitting in a shared kitchen that is dirty, most people would like it to be a little cleaner, but most people will be afraid of being the first one to be asked to clean it up. And that's precisely the same dynamic we have with the climate debate. It's not about the kitchen supposed to being dirty. It's the fact that nobody wants to start while the others are still sitting around a table and adding dirt.
What I find really interesting is that the new kids on the block, they're expected to have all the solutions to the climate crisis already planned and thought out in a way that past movements have never had to have responsibility for.
Times have changed in this. I don't know if PR agencies are getting better on the other side, saying, well, if someone comes and says no, then ask them for the alternative and ask them, well, how are you going to do it?
That's Regine Richter, lead campaigner against fossil fuels at Urgewald.
But that's what's happening. If you say, well, we need to get out of coal, oil, and gas, then it's but how are we going to run our society? Explain to me. You really have to be. The demand is much more. You have to come up with the alternative. You have to have it ready in your pocket, and that's. I think that's just unfair because those people running. Those people planning gas plants, those people running gas plants or coal plants, they're not the ones that have the alternative of what's happening to the climate. So, it's really asking more from the people that are protesting it than, you're ready yourself to do. There is this example of the European Union prohibiting the use of light bulbs. And when it was first discussed, it was really this this is going to be the end of, lights in apartments. And after it was clear that it was going to be prohibited, then surprise, surprise, there were lots of other possibilities to replace the light bulb by much less energy-consuming alternatives. So there is a point about making a clear announcement, making a clear regulation, and then, there will be solutions coming up.
There's definitely a disconnect, partially because the measures that Letzte Generation are demanding are actually pretty widely supported throughout Germany.
The demands might be broadly popular, but Letzte Generation is most definitely not. A recent poll of Germans said that 60% disagree completely with the group's tactics. However, the group specifically doesn't see themselves as part of the consensus-building part of the climate movement. Carla Hinrichs, a spokeswoman for the group, said, "I don't want to stick myself to roads. I'm not doing it for fun, but because we see from examples in history that disruptive, non-violent action can be the most effective type of action. We are like a fire alarm, which is annoying, but necessary."
The main experience, I think, of a climate activist, especially in the context of last generation, is that you always have people that come up to you and that tell you, what you're doing is wrong. You should do it differently. And that's been happening for a year. And that happens from people from the far right over to people to the far left. And it's just people over and over saying, you're doing it wrong, you should do it differently.
This is Tim Wechselmann-Cassim again, talking about how Letzte Generation has built up support for its actions since the beginning of 2022.
But we're kind of used to that by now, and we just keep on going because we're kind of convinced of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And what actually has happened is that this kind of background noise almost is that it has kind of been reduced a bit, so we don't get these sort of benevolent tips as much anymore, and we have more and more people that actually beginning to understand what we're doing. People that formerly criticized us very, very harshly and saying, what you're doing is destroying, the necessary majorities and you're climate terrorists or whatnot. And we have more and more people that are actually beginning to understand the gravity of the situation, but also our approach towards it. I think it's also something you can probably see on the one hand on the media coverage. I think it probably took half a year until the first semi-positive report or not all too negative report about us came out, And also if you look on our social media page, a year ago, it just had people only, spouting hate and whatnot. And more and more, if you now look to our posts, I think it's usually even 50-50 by now. So you have 50% of people saying you're terrorists, and they don't have to repeat the things that they're saying. And the other half, people saying, please go on. I'm standing behind you. I'm not ready yet to actually go out on the street with you, but I'm counting on you. And that's something which has definitely changed.
This is Tim again describing the intentionality behind Letzte Generation's approach. They're not exactly having fun out there getting screamed at, assaulted, and arrested.
What I can say is the night before is always incredibly stressful, and it's very tense for me personally, but I think that's the same for most people. And in the morning you wake up very, very early, and it's still very tense because you kind of, you have to get there. And then when you're like right at the crossing of the street, you're like, okay, now, it's like the moment okay, let's go. And you just go on the street. And that's when the most intense part starts, because that's when you're actually committing the crime, or when you start blockading people and they get out of the cars and they're certainly going to yell at you. They might push you off the street. They might pull you off the street. We've had cars who tried to run us over. We've had cars that really ran into people, and you never really know what to expect. But that's also when the adrenaline is the highest. And personally, I wouldn't say fear is the right word, because I'm afraid of the future. I'm not so much afraid of the situation on the street, because it's like, okay, the worst that's going to happen is they're going to run me over. And that's kind of something I can expect. And if it's going to happen, it's fine, because otherwise I wouldn't go into these blockades, right? If I wouldn't be fine with it, I wouldn't be there in the first place. So I go there and it's like, okay, you've committed to this, you're going to do this, you know why you're doing this, and it's just a lot of adrenaline. And it's like, I'm always very focused, and you always realize a lot of things happening around you, but you don't do a lot because you only sit there. And then once the police arrives, it's usually the moment when everything calms down a bit, because the pedestrians, they don't attack you anymore, and the police have their routine, and they just start to do their thing, and that's usually when the things calm down. moment from where you go to the street, onto the street, up until the moment where the police arrives, that's certainly the most stressful.
So you're saying you're more afraid of the future than you are of getting hit by a car?
Yeah.
And in a year when it's been hard to keep the climate crisis in the headlines, Letzte Generation has managed, with less than 1,000 active members, to stay in the headlines fairly consistently.
There's a lot of hate directed against, especially the last generation, which for the past year really has kept the climate movement alive. And then there's a lot of groups that couldn't really kind of felt they couldn't support last generation. Now, I have been a great supporter and admirer of last generation, but their alliance building work could have been a bit better. But they were pretty fucking busy, and any new player in a movement scene that comes up, sort of shakes everything up, does that. We did the same with Ende, Gelände.
That's Tadzio Müller, longtime climate activist and political philosopher.
You were like super arrogant. You're the new kid on the block, and you're doing everything more sexy than the old players. And it's very hard to then be reined in by them. So I totally get why last generation has been a bit difficult to kind of catch in alliance building processes. But basically there has been all this, because they've taken the fight into society and said, okay, you're not shutting down your car industry. You're not shutting down your lignite mines. You're just going on and on and on. So we're going to start disturbing people's everyday lives to try and have a more pronounced effect. And I have supported that strategy, but it has also led to a very negative framing of climate activism as something that's annoying. Now, of course, if climate activists is something that you encounter mostly while they are stopping you from getting to work or to your date, or somebody might be on a way to a sexy date and be stopped by last generation. I get that people are annoyed. I mean, I still think that last generation is justified doing it, but it's basically led to the framing of climate activism as irritating and, as it were, against society and against a reasonable normality within where people just want to get to work.
Now, let's get into this comparison of the Letzte Generation to terrorists. Late last year, a CSU politician, Alexander Dobrindt, started calling the Letzte Generation the Klima RAF, making comparisons to the Red Army faction. This is despite the fact that even the German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution came out saying that this comparison is essentially bogus, especially since the Letzte Generation has never hurt anyone and the Red Army faction carried out violent actions that killed people. Tadzio Müller argues that there are also specific reasons why the climate movement has not, in fact, turned violent.
So Andreas Malm talks about, while we understand the strategic pacifism with which the climate movement has worked, in a sense that it has gained a significant amount of legitimacy for a movement whose story is actually quite radical, in the sense that the climate movement says Germany has a completely unjustified and unjust position in the world. We need to change away from fossil fuels. We need to change away from a growth economy. These are things even Fridays for Future now says. These are all pretty radical claims. For many years, we were seen as the good guys, so we could expand like this German tradition of civil disobedience that I mentioned that came out of the anti-nuclear movement. We just kind of kept moving the boundaries of acceptable action a little further, right? So you go from just like blockading a street to blockading a digger. You go from blockading a digger to taking out the stones from under the train tracks. And so the condition today is totally different from the 60s and 70s and where the RAF emerged. One is, back then the left was on the up. Like the left was generally sort of on a global offensive. In the 70s, when I spoke to my old professors, they thought the revolution was around the corner. Thomas Sankara was, Che Guevara and others were all like, those were revolutionary intellectuals and practitioners. And in the global north, outfits like the RAF felt inspired by their armed struggle and said, well, we need to do something that mirrors the intensity of the struggle of the comrades in the south and defeat the imperialist beast where it lives, kind of. So it was a different context, different global context, where the left was on the offensive, using armed struggle as a method. And thus, just the symbol of the Kalashnikov, right? We all know the silhouette. Why do we know the silhouette of a sort of old Soviet machine gun? Because it became a symbol of liberation struggles around the world. So in that sense, like the climate justice movement too, just like the movements back then, like we take our direction very much from movements in the global south. And those today have been, the authoritarianism that beat back those movements, I think, from the US to the rest of the world in the 70s and 80s. If you look at a country like Guatemala, where you had a 36-year insurrection, and again, in 96 it ended, and the country's totally fucked. And I'm sort of jumping around a bit. It's like, essentially, the political context is one where the left has had to withdraw in terms of tactical space. Like, no, we cannot build armed militias as a left. No, but look, the left's on the defensive, organizing sabotage action. Today, I spoke to a comrade who had, in a signal group with people, only people known to her, organized an action meeting point, and they were intercepted by the cops. They don't know if that was human intel, as in, is that group infiltrated? They don't know if it was spatial intel, as in, is my living room whatever bugged, or if it was data mining, or a signal is actually breached. I spoke to her, I was like, my God, why are you not freaking out? I'm saying is that essentially, why aren't we being militant? 3 reasons. Partly, we've seen it as a general good because it would decrease social legitimacy. Partly because the global context of left activism is one where we've had to, in terms of tactics, again, we cannot organize armed militias in Germany, although there are armed Nazis in every fucking police force in this country, because we don't have the legitimacy of that. And this is always the point, people don't have to necessarily agree with protest. There has to be a good degree of legitimacy. Otherwise, the social reaction will become absolutely devastating.
So are we at risk of seeing this movement become more radical, though? If the government keeps dragging its heels on climate change, clashes between the Letzte Generation and motorists increase, and some media sources keep focusing on the controversy and not the issues, what's going to happen here?
The Red Army faction was a group of people who came out of the student movement in the 60s, felt that the student movement had failed, felt that West Germany was a proto-fascist state.
That's Paul Hockenos, journalist and political commentator working on climate issues.
And that they, as urban guerrillas, were going to bring the revolution from the third world to the first world. And they assassinated a number of German politicians. They blew up prisons. It was a violent spree that took all of West Germany a hold. And it was a very terrible time in Germany for ordinary people who were scared that they might somehow themselves become victims of this terrorist organization, but also for the left, because the crackdown of the West German government on these groups and on any other leftist groups that were at all like them or expressed any sympathy for them was terrible. It was called Die Bleierne Zeit, the leaden time in Germany, and it set the left back. It didn't accomplish anything. And young people today, they might not know so much about the Red Army faction and its consequences, but there are lots of films and lots of books. So I think this is present in the German consciousness that this kind of violent terrorism isn't going to get anybody anywhere, that it could even set the movement back. So there's that negative example of the Red Army faction. I think that's one very good reason why we're not going to see exactly that kind of violence. But, there are people who advocate it. For example, the Swedish social scientist Andreas Malm wrote a book in 2020 called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, where he advocates that the climate movement take more radical steps, that it's not going to be taken seriously and it's not going to accomplish its goals simply by going out on the streets in the hundreds of thousands. This was also a lesson that the social movements of the 70s and 80s learned, and that's why they created the Green Party. So in addition to some of these more radical forms of protest, you also have now a climate party, so the Klimaliste. Certainly there's some kind of infrastructure for more violent acts. It doesn't take all that much to blow up a pipeline, and you already see transportation hubs being blocked and things like that. But I don't think a radicalization is going to be effective. I don't think it's going to accomplish what the climate movement needs at this minute, which is more momentum for more legislative changes. You have the Greens in power in Germany. You have, in the European level of the European Union, the European Green Deal, which is by far the most progressive climate legislations and policies in the world right now. I mean, what we need are those things pushed forward even faster. And this is something where I think the climate movement can still be valuable. I mean, when you put hundreds of thousands of people on the street, that's cover for these politicians. They can point to this mobilization and use that to push forward policies. That's where we are right now.
That was Paul Hockenos again. A lot of people we spoke to for this series see the use of the Red Army faction comparison and language like radical and terrorist as petty tactics used by politicians to polarize the public. Tim from Letzte Generation shares this opinion.
I wouldn't just put it down as noise, because I think there's a very, very serious component to it. Not so much if you have random anonymous internet people yelling words and terrorists at us, but if it's, and that's what's happened, what's still happening, if you have like the leaders of the biggest or some of the biggest parties in our society, in our democracy, calling us terrorists, because that's serious. That's really, really serious. And it really shows, in my eyes at least, it somehow shows their true colors, because they'd rather use our protests, because I'm not quite sure if they actually believe what they're saying, if they actually think we're going to start blowing things up or so, because we are actually quite clear on what we're doing and what we're never going to do. And you just have to look into our website to see this. But it's serious. And the lengths that these people are willing to go to just, I guess, make, to drum up election, to make Wahlkampf, you'd call it. For personal gain. I think that's actually what these people are doing. I don't think it's a big of a huge conspiracy, but I think there's people that are just very willing to jump these drums of calling us terrorists, just to polarize people and to radicalize other people and to make minor gains in elections for their own personal gain, which then again is very dangerous for us, because these words eventually lead to violence against us. And we've had a lot of threats, Morddrohungen, and I mean, we get that regularly, but also more serious threats. And it's something that is not something personally, as I said, I'm kind of committed to this, and I know why I'm doing it. And compared to the climate crisis, it's really fine for me. But there are many other people also doing this, and it's I don't know, I just wonder if these people calling us Klima-RAF and climate terrorists, if these people are actually aware of what they're doing by calling us those words. Because we do these online talks, or I do like the online talks, we have offline talks twice a week, and anybody can join these talks. Any right-wing politician can come up and just get in there and listen to what we're saying and ask very critical questions. That would be fine. We would be very open to it. We would actually be happy if these people would show up, because then we could discuss with them. And they don't have to agree with us, but they could at least try to understand us. But then politicians usually do is they take the easy roads and they call us terrorists, because that's what people want to hear. And it's the easy answer towards the climate crisis as well, because if we weren't terrorists and if there was some legitimacy to our protests, that would obviously mean that politicians aren't taking the crisis seriously.
These climate protesters are facing very real consequences for their protest actions. In April this year, a 24-year-old woman who had glued herself to a painting in the Gelände gallery last year was sentenced to 4 months in jail without parole. The same month, another 3 protesters were sentenced to 3 months in jail, each for halting traffic in Heilbronn. This was a record sentence for such an action, but the judge justified it by saying that the protesters said they'd return to the streets to do the same thing again. According to Germany's Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, 580 crimes have been attributed to the Letzte Generation since the beginning of last year. And there are calls from German elites to change laws in order to be able to tackle these protesters with more force and create more of a legal deterrent to their tactics.
Extending preventative detention in Berlin has been raised by some, like the head of the Berlin police, as a means to clamp down on protesters in the capital city. Preventative detention is when someone is arrested and held in a holding facility like a prison or a police station on suspicion that they are going to commit a crime. Whilst rarely implemented, these controversial laws are used by states to prevent disruptive blockades or threats to major events.
Far from just theoretical changes to the law, enforcement agencies across the country are becoming more hostile to the group and using force to clamp down on protesters. As mentioned earlier, in late May, police raided Letzte Generation activists' homes and organizing spaces and headquarters all over Germany, under the suspicion that the group was becoming a criminal organization.
Just listen to how sinister that sounds. Suspicion of becoming a criminal organization. It's very hard to see how these preemptive arrests are in keeping with the freedom of expression and right to assembly. It is really striking the kinds of rhetorics and punishments that are being proposed for a group that hasn't actually used violence at all.
We're kind of fighting a game against time, both because of tipping points and the climate system, and because it's like 10 past 12, honestly, and we've emitted so much more CO2 than we should, and we should have gone the other way a long while ago. But also because I see the actions that we're taking and the way that we're being organized, in my eyes at least, is very much the last chance of actually turning this around politically. And we're kind of playing this game of, we're trying to mobilize people, we're doing actions, and we try to mobilize more people through our actions. And that has worked in the past year. We've grown from like 30 people to 1,000 people, but 1,000 people that have participated in action once or so, or maybe more times, but yeah. But that's not enough to actually pressure the government to actually do something. It's not enough to actually bring forward meaningful change. So we're very much trying to mobilize more people and to get more people to join us. At the same time, as you just talked about, the state repression is being increased, very much so, in many ways, and we're all facing courts, and you have these house searches and other things that are happening. And what we're trying to mobilize enough people to push something forward, to carry this on. And if we're not fast enough, if we're not successful enough, if our presentations aren't convincing enough and we don't manage to mobilize enough people in time, eventually the state repression is going to take over and we're going to collapse, right? Because all these people that are currently holding these talks, doing these presentations, if they're all locked up in jail, or if they have so many fines and so many court hearings that they just can't do this work anymore, we won't be able to hold up our actions. And that's a point I'm also quite worried about, because if we're unsuccessful in trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve and actually getting the ball rolling and getting society on board towards meaningful change, I'm quite afraid of what's going to come afterwards, because we're strictly peaceful and nonviolent and we'd never do anything else. But the situation both here and around the world could deteriorate very rapidly. And as I said, besides our work and our theory of change, as it's called, I don't see another way at the moment. I might be wrong, and there might be other things that are happening at the same time, but currently I just don't see it.
I think, as with so many in Tim's generation and ours too, there is a great worry about what happens if politics fails to act. What happens when the climate starts to spiral?
That is exactly the point. Fridays for Future, Letzte Generation, Extinction Rebellion, these are predominantly young people, and the organising principles of all of them is to uphold their faith in democracy. There is currently no climate organisation openly advocating sabotage as a strategy, none engaging in violence. They aren't trying to engage in regime change or even replace democracy with some other form of climate-led authoritarianism. At the start of this episode, we set out to see whether these groups were radical in their demands. And by and large, what we found is that they have a deep faith that democracy and fairly reasonable policy demands could pave the way towards the future that we all want to see.
Free or very cheap public transport, speed limits on motorways, and the demand for a citizens-led assembly to work out other policies that could work to reduce emissions.
Our other question was whether their tactics could be regarded as radical, and they are not committing violent acts on members of the public, and they are not doing permanent damage to infrastructure like you could imagine when, for instance, a sabotage campaign would be employed.
What I found really moving was when Tim was talking about what it was like to face that level of abuse on the streets during these protests. Even if they aren't committing violence towards others, in a way, they're putting themselves in positions where violence is committed against them, or the threat of it is very real. Gluing your hands to roads is not something you would comfortably do without serious conviction. And I have to say, Tim's whole countenance changed when he talked about this with me. His body language, I mean, you could tell this person is affected by these interactions with his fellow citizens. So they are committing acts of violence on their own bodies in a way. Maybe that's radical, right? I mean, it is a step way beyond what we've seen before.
I agree. The tactics used by this new wave of protesters is a leap beyond what the Fridays groups were doing on the street and performing a totally different function. They aren't angling for mass support. By their estimation, they have that already. Majorities for climate action already exist, partly spurred on by the previous wave of mass movement organising done by Fridays for Future. So what they really want to do is to use more radical forms of protest to gain attention for policy demands within the democratic system that they see as vital to tackle climate change, but get them adopted now.
So I guess we would summarize by saying that these means of protest are maybe more radical because they're putting themselves in harm's way. They're demanding the conversation around policy is had and had now. But the demands themselves are well within the current political imagination and therefore maybe not so radical at all.
Yeah, that's it. This series was conceived and produced by me, Izzy Toxey, and Anna-Marie Harrison. The script was written by me and Anna-Marie Harrison. Editing was done by me and Sebastian Philippe. Thank you also to Daniel Stern for the artwork for the series and for all the technical help that he gave us during the making of this series. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe where you get your podcasts for more content from Sticking Point and also our sister podcast, Radio Speckhout. Thanks, and till next time.